Eleanor Turner sat quietly in her small, tidy living room, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. The soft hum of the heater filled the silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floor. Her house, nestled at the end of a quiet suburban street, reflected her life, calm, orderly, but undeniably lonely. At 72 years old, Eleanor was used to solitude. Her husband had passed away years ago, and her daughter Lauren hadn't visited in over a decade. The reasons for their estrangement were complex, but time had only deepened the chasm between them. Now, Eleanor found herself longing for connection, even if it came in the form of a companion who couldn't speak back. It was this longing that brought her to the animal shelter that crisp autumn morning. She'd heard about a retired police dog that needed a home, a Doberman named Zeus. At first, she hesitated. A Doberman? She'd pictured adopting a smaller, gentler breed, something more manageable. But something about Zeus's story tugged at her heart. The shelter was bustling with activity when Eleanor arrived. The sound of barking dogs echoed off the walls, but one bark stood out from the rest, deep, commanding, and steady. "That's Zeus," the shelter worker said, gesturing toward a large enclosure. Inside, a sleek black and tan Doberman stood, his sharp ears perked, and his intense brown eyes locked on Eleanor. Eleanor took a hesitant step forward, clutching her purse tightly. Zeus's size was intimidating, to say the least. He looked like a soldier ready for duty, his muscular frame exuding power. "He was one of the best K9s we've had," the worker explained. "But after retiring, he needed a quieter life. He's incredibly loyal, but he does need someone who can handle his energy and instincts." Eleanor frowned. "Instincts?" The worker smiled. "He's trained to protect and serve. It's second nature to him. But don't worry, he's a sweetheart once he gets to know you." Eleanor glanced back at Zeus, who had tilted his head slightly as if studying her. She took a deep breath and stepped closer to the enclosure. "Hello, Zeus," she said softly. The dog's tail wagged once, a slow, deliberate movement that made Eleanor's heart stir. In that moment, she made her decision. Bringing Zeus home felt like welcoming a stranger into her quiet routine. He explored the house methodically, sniffing every corner, as if assessing his new territory. Eleanor watched him from the kitchen, unsure of how to interact with him. "He's just a dog," she muttered to herself, trying to ignore the knot of nerves in her stomach. But Zeus felt like more than just a dog. There was an air of purpose about him, a sense that he understood things in a way most animals didn't. The first night was uneventful. Zeus slept on the rug by the front door, his body stretched out, but his ears alert. Eleanor noticed his vigilance, how he seemed to be constantly scanning for threats even in the safety of her home. "You don't need to protect me," she said, as she prepared her tea the next morning. "It's just us here. Nothing exciting ever happens in this neighborhood." Zeus, lying at her feet, blinked up at her as if to say, "We'll see about that." Over the next few days, Eleanor began to adjust to Zeus's presence. At first, his sheer size and energy made her uneasy, but she quickly realized he was gentle with her, almost careful. He followed her from room to room, always keeping her in his line of sight. One evening, as Eleanor read a book in her armchair, Zeus sat by the window, his ears twitching. She noticed his posture stiffen, his gaze locked on something outside. "What is it, boy?" she asked, setting her book down. Zeus let out a low growl, a sound that sent shivers down Eleanor's spine. She moved cautiously to the window and peered outside, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the dimly lit street and the shadowy outlines of trees swaying in the wind. "Probably just a squirrel," she said, though her voice wavered. Zeus didn't relax until several minutes later, when he finally returned to his spot by the door. One afternoon, Eleanor sat on the porch with Zeus by her side. A neighbor walking by paused to admire him. "He's beautiful," the woman said. "But a Doberman? He must be a handful." Eleanor smiled faintly. "He's different, but I think we're figuring each other out." The neighbor nodded. "Well, you're lucky to have him. Dobermans are incredibly loyal. He'll take care of you." Eleanor looked down at Zeus, who was sitting perfectly still, his eyes scanning the street. "I hope so," she murmured. That night, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she found herself talking to Zeus as if he were an old friend. "You know, I wasn't sure about you at first," she admitted, sitting on the edge of her bed. Zeus lay on the rug near her feet, his ears twitching at her voice. "But you're growing on me. You make this house feel less empty." Zeus lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. In that moment, Eleanor felt an unspoken bond forming, a connection she hadn't realized she'd been missing. As she turned off the lights, she glanced at Zeus one last time, He was already back at his post by the door, his body relaxed but his gaze sharp. "Good night, boy," she whispered. Zeus didn't move, but his steady presence filled the house with a sense of safety Eleanor hadn't felt in years. Eleanor woke up to the sound of soft footsteps moving around the house. For a moment, her groggy mind struggled to place the noise, but then she remembered Zeus. She found him pacing near the front door, his nails clicking gently against the hardwood floor. His tail wagged faintly when he saw her. "Good morning, boy," she said, stretching her stiff joints as she moved toward him. "What's gotten into you?" Zeus padded to the window, his posture alert. Eleanor followed his gaze but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the empty street bathed in early morning light. She shook her head and gave him a reassuring pat. "You're always on guard, aren't you?" "Well, nothing exciting ever happens around here. You'll see." Over breakfast, Eleanor realized how quickly Zeus had become a part of her routine. She found herself setting an extra place at the table, even though Zeus didn't sit in a chair, and talking to him as if he were a person. "I used to do this with Lauren, you know," she said, pouring herself a second cup of tea. "She loved pancakes, ate them with syrup and way too much butter. I told her it'd catch up to her someday, but she just laughed." Zeus sat quietly, his head tilted as if he were listening. Eleanor chuckled softly. "You're better company than I thought you'd be." As the days turned into weeks, the bond between Eleanor and Zeus deepened. She grew accustomed to his silent vigilance, the way he would follow her around the house, his presence both comforting and steady. During their walks around the neighborhood, Zeus always stayed close to Eleanor, his movements precise and deliberate. Other dog owners would stop and marvel at his composure. "He's so well behaved," one of them said, holding the leash of a small yapping terrier. "How do you manage him?" Eleanor smiled, brushing a strand of gray hair out of her face. "I think he's the one managing me." The truth was, Zeus didn't require much managing. He seemed to instinctively know what was needed, when to stand guard, when to comfort, when to pull her gently back to the sidewalk if her thoughts wandered too far. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Eleanor picked up the newspaper and frowned at the headline. "Attempted burglaries increase in local neighborhood." "Well, that's unsettling," she muttered, glancing at Zeus. The dog didn't seem bothered, but Eleanor noticed he'd begun spending more time near the windows, his sharp eyes scanning the yard. She dismissed it as part of his nature, though a small part of her felt reassured by his watchful presence. Zeus's instincts became even more apparent during their walks. One day, as they strolled past an unfamiliar car parked on the corner, Zeus suddenly stopped. His ears perked, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. "What is it, boy?" Eleanor asked, gripping his leash tightly. The car's engine roared to life and it sped off down the street. Eleanor's heart raced, though she told herself it was probably just a coincidence. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that Zeus had sensed something she hadn't. Back at home, Eleanor tried to push the incident from her mind. She sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Zeus lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes remained fixed on the street. "You're always watching, aren't you?" she said, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "I suppose that's a good thing." That night, Eleanor had trouble sleeping. Her mind kept drifting to the stories she'd read in the newspaper, the car that had lingered too long, and the way Zeus had reacted. She got up and wandered into the living room, where she found Zeus sitting by the front door, his body still and alert. "You're not much of a sleeper, are you?" she said with a nervous laugh. Zeus didn't respond, of course, but his calm presence eased her unease. As she returned to bed, Eleanor couldn't help but feel grateful for him. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed having someone to rely on, someone who made her feel safe. The next morning, as Eleanor prepared breakfast, she noticed Zeus standing by the back door, his nose pressed against the glass. "Do you want to go outside?" she asked, opening the door to let him into the yard. Zeus stepped out cautiously, his ears twitching as he scanned the area. He moved toward the fence, sniffing the ground intently. Eleanor watched him from the doorway, her brow furrowing. "What are you looking for, boy?" she murmured. Zeus didn't find anything unusual, but his behavior left Eleanor uneasy. She decided to double-check the locks on all the doors and windows before leaving for her afternoon errands. As she walked through the aisles of the grocery store later that day, Eleanor found herself thinking about Zeus. She'd adopted him to fill the quiet spaces in her life, but he'd become so much more than a companion. He was a protector, a guardian in a way she hadn't anticipated. When she returned home, she was greeted by Zeus at the door, his tail wagging. Eleanor smiled and scratched his head. "Miss me, did you?" She set her bags on the counter and began unpacking, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. That night, as Eleanor sat in her armchair reading a book, Zeus moved to the window and let out a low growl. Eleanor's eyes darted up, her heart skipping a beat. She set the book down and walked over to him. "Is someone out there?" she asked, peering into the darkness. The street was empty, but the uneasy feeling in her chest lingered. She placed a hand on Zeus's back, feeling the tension in his body. "Whatever it is, I'm glad you're here," she whispered. Zeus didn't move from his spot by the window for the rest of the night. Eleanor returned to her chair, glancing at him every so often. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, but for now she trusted Zeus to keep her safe. The night was unusually quiet. Eleanor sat in her armchair, knitting a scarf as the soft glow of a table lamp bathed the living room in warmth. Zeus lay at the front door as always, his body stretched out but his ears alert to every sound. Eleanor glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. She stifled a yawn, placing her knitting needles on the side table. "Come on, Zeus," she said, standing and stretching. "Time for bed." Zeus didn't move. His ears twitched and his gaze remained locked on the door. Eleanor paused, frowning. "What is it, boy?" Zeus let out a low, rumbling growl. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She turned to look at the door but saw nothing unusual. "Probably just the wind," she murmured, trying to convince herself. But Zeus didn't relax. He stood, his muscles tense, and moved closer to the door. Then she heard it, faint, almost imperceptible, the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside. Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes darted to the phone on the table, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. Zeus barked, loud and sharp, the sound cutting through the silence like a warning bell. "Who's there?" Eleanor called out, her voice trembling. No answer. Zeus's barking grew louder and more ferocious as he stood at the door, his body rigid, ready to attack. Eleanor's fear deepened as she heard the unmistakable sound of someone fiddling with the lock. Outside, two men stood by the back door, their faces partially obscured by the shadows. "Didn't think anyone would be awake," one of them muttered, pulling a crowbar from his jacket. "Just hurry up," the other hissed. "The old lady won't even know what's happening." The first man jimmied the lock, but the noise of Zeus's barking made him pause. "She's got a dog," he said, glancing nervously toward the front of the house. "So what?" the second man replied, clearly annoyed. "It's just a dog. Keep working." Inside, Eleanor's hands shook as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "There's someone trying to break into my house," she whispered into the receiver. The operator's calm voice came through. "Stay on the line, ma'am. Officers are on their way. Are you safe?" Eleanor looked at Zeus, who was now pacing between the front and back doors, his barks unrelenting. "I have a dog," she said. He's protecting me." The operator reassured her, but Eleanor's attention was drawn to the sudden sound of breaking glass. Her heart pounded as she realized the men had shattered a window in the back. Zeus bolted toward the noise, his growls turning into deep, guttural snarls. Eleanor followed him hesitantly, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The first man climbed through the broken window, landing awkwardly in the kitchen. "Told you it'd be easy," he said with a smirk. The second man followed, scanning the darkened room. "Let's just grab what we can and get out of here," he muttered. But they didn't get far. Zeus appeared in the doorway, his body low to the ground, his teeth bared. His growl was a warning, primal and fierce. "What the hell is that?" the first man stammered, backing up slightly. "It's just a dog," the second man said, though his voice wavered. He stepped forward, raising the crowbar. Before he could swing it, Zeus lunged. The room erupted in chaos. Zeus's jaws clamped down on the man's arm, forcing him to drop the crowbar with a loud clang. The man screamed, trying to shake the dog off, but Zeus was relentless. The first man panicked, stumbling back toward the broken window. "Let's get out of here," he shouted, scrambling to climb back outside. Zeus released the second man just long enough to chase the first out of the house. The man tripped over the garden fence, disappearing into the darkness. The second man, clutching his injured arm, tried to make a run for it, but Zeus was faster. He cornered the man in the kitchen, his snarls echoing off the walls. Eleanor peeked around the corner, her eyes wide with fear and amazement. She'd never seen Zeus like this, so focused, so determined. He stood over the intruder, his teeth bared, his growls low and menacing. "Don't hurt me," the man pleaded, backing into a corner. Eleanor found her voice. "Stay where you are," she said, her tone firmer than she expected. "The police are on their way." Zeus didn't move from his position. keeping the man pinned until the sound of sirens filled the air. When the police arrived, they found the man sitting on the kitchen floor, his injured arm cradled against his chest. Zeus stood guard a few feet away, his body still tense but his tail wagging faintly when he saw Eleanor. The officers took statements from Eleanor, marveling at Zeus's actions. "Looks like you've got yourself a real hero here," one of them said, scratching Zeus behind the ears. Eleanor managed a shaky smile. "I had no idea he was capable of this." Another officer nodded. "Dobermans like him are incredible. He must have been trained as a K9. Eleanor looked down at Zeus, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "He saved my life," she said softly. The officer smiled. "You're lucky to have him. Not many dogs could have handled this like he did." That night, after the intruder was taken away and the house quieted down, Eleanor sat on the couch with Zeus at her feet. Her hands still trembled, but her heart was full. "You're amazing, you know that," she said, leaning down to stroke his fur. Zeus looked up at her, his eyes warm and steady. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt truly safe. The following morning, Eleanor awoke to the sound of Zeus softly pacing the living room. Despite the events of the previous night, the house felt calm, quiet, but not the kind of silence that unnerved her. It was the silence of safety, of knowing that Zeus had her back. As she sipped her tea at the kitchen table, Eleanor reflected on everything that had happened. The shattered window had already been boarded up by a kind neighbor, and the police had promised to follow up. Yet, what stuck with her most wasn't the fear of the break-in. It was the way Zeus had protected her. "You're a hero, you know that," she said, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. Zeus, sitting at her feet, wagged his tail gently, his eyes never leaving hers. The sound of a knock at the door startled her. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, her heart skipping a beat. She glanced at Zeus, who immediately stood, his body alert but not tense. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor walked to the door and opened it. Standing on the porch was a woman Eleanor hadn't seen in years. Her dark hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and her eyes, though tired, were unmistakably familiar. "Lauren," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "Hi, Mom," Lauren said, her expression soft but hesitant. "I heard what happened. Are you okay?" Eleanor stood frozen, unsure of what to say. It had been over a decade since Lauren had last set foot in the house. The pain of their estrangement, of arguments that spiraled out of control and years of silence, rushed back like a tidal wave. "I'm fine," Eleanor managed, stepping aside to let her daughter in. Lauren's eyes darted around the house as she entered, taking in the boarded-up window and the faint signs of last night's chaos. Her gaze landed on Zeus, who stood by Eleanor's side, watching her intently. "And this must be Zeus," Lauren said, her tone light but unsure. "He saved me," Eleanor said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "If it weren't for him," she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Lauren crouched slightly, holding out her hand to Zeus. "Hey there, big guy," she said softly. Zeus sniffed her hand, then nudged it gently with his nose. "He's incredible," Lauren said, standing up again. "I can't believe you were here all alone when it happened." Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I've been alone for a long time, Lauren," she said quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Lauren looked down, guilt flickering across her face. "I know, Mum," she said softly. "I should have been here. You don't have to explain," Eleanor interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "You're here now. That's what matters." The two women sat down in the living room, Zeus settling at Eleanor's feet. For the first time in years, they talked, really talked. Lauren admitted how life had overwhelmed her, how she'd let pride and resentment keep her away. Eleanor, in turn, confessed how much she'd missed her daughter, how she had longed to reach out but hadn't known how. "I was so angry," Lauren said, her voice breaking. I thought you didn't care." Eleanor reached across the table, placing a hand over her daughter's. "I've always cared, Lauren, I just didn't know how to fix things." Tears welled in Lauren's eyes, and she gave a shaky nod. "I don't want to lose more time, Mom." "You won't," Eleanor said softly. As the day went on, the tension between them began to ease. They laughed about old memories, like the time Lauren had begged for a puppy as a child, only to be terrified when it jumped on her. "You always said I needed a guard dog," Lauren teased, gesturing to Zeus. "Guess you were right." Eleanor smiled, looking down at Zeus, who seemed content to let the two women bond. "I never expected him to be more than a companion," she admitted. "But he's so much more than that. He brought you back to me." Lauren's eyes softened. "He really is something special." Before leaving that evening, Lauren paused by the door, hesitating. "Mum," she said, her voice tentative, "would it be okay if I came by more often? I don't want this to be a one-time thing." Eleanor's heart swelled with hope. "I'd like that, Lauren. I'd like that very much." Lauren knelt down to pet Zeus one last time. "You take good care of her, okay?" she said, her voice light but full of meaning. Zeus responded with a soft wag of his tail. After Lauren left, Eleanor sat on the porch with Zeus, watching the sun set. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't realized she was missing. "You've done more than save my life," she said, stroking Zeus's fur. "You've brought my family back to me." Zeus leaned into her touch, his eyes warm and steady. The quiet of the evening felt different now, not lonely but full of possibility. Eleanor smiled to herself, knowing that this was only the beginning of something new. The air felt heavier that night, as if something unseen was pressing down on the quiet suburban street. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, finishing her tea, as Zeus lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, but his ears twitching at the faintest sound. It had been a few days since the first break-in, and Eleanor had convinced herself that the danger had passed. The police had assured her that the captured intruder was unlikely to return, but a small part of her couldn't help but worry about the second man who had escaped. Zeus, however, seemed on edge. He had been more vigilant than usual, pacing near the windows and doors as if anticipating something. Eleanor tried to reassure him with soft words and gentle pats, but the tension in his body remained. "Relax, boy," she said, placing her teacup in the sink. "It's just another quiet night." But Zeus didn't relax. He lifted his head, his ears perking sharply at a sound Eleanor couldn't hear. Then he stood, his posture rigid, and moved toward the back door. "What is it now?" Eleanor asked, following him. She froze when she saw the faint shadow of a figure moving past the window. Her heart began to race, and her breath caught in her throat. Outside, the second intruder crouched low near the back door, his movements slow and deliberate. He was angry that his partner had been caught, angry that they hadn't gotten anything from the house. "This time," he muttered to himself, gripping a wrench tightly, "I'm not leaving empty-handed." He tested the handle of the door, his jaw tightening when he found it locked. He moved to the broken window from the previous attempt, now boarded up, and began prying at the edges. Inside, Zeus's growl rumbled low and deep, vibrating through the kitchen like a warning bell. Eleanor's hands shook as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "There's someone trying to break in again," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "Stay calm, ma'am," the operator replied. "Officers are on their way." Eleanor set the phone down but stayed on the line, her eyes locked on Zeus. The dog's growls grew louder as the sounds of the intruder's efforts intensified. "Do you think you can handle this again, boy?" Eleanor murmured. Zeus didn't take his eyes off the door, his body tense and ready. The man finally forced the window open, cursing under his breath as he climbed inside. His feet hit the floor with a dull thud, and he straightened, scanning the darkened room. "This time," he muttered, "no dog's gonna stop me." But before he could take another step, Zeus launched himself at the man with startling speed. The intruder barely had time to react as the dog lunged, his teeth snapping just inches from the man's arm. The man swung the wrench wildly, but Zeus dodged the blow, circling him with precision. His growls were fierce, unrelenting, each one a clear warning: leave now, or face the consequences. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, torn between fear and awe. Zeus moved like a trained professional, keeping the man off balance, forcing him to retreat further into the kitchen. The intruder tried to make a run for it, heading toward the back door, but Zeus blocked his path, his teeth bared and his eyes blazing. "Get back!" the man shouted, swinging the wrench again. This time, Zeus didn't dodge. He lunged, his jaws clamping down on the man's arm with enough force to make him drop the weapon. The man screamed, falling to his knees as Zeus held him in place. Eleanor finally found her voice. "Stop struggling!" she shouted, her fear giving way to anger. "The police are on their way." The man groaned, clutching his arm as he glared up at her. "Call off your dog." Eleanor stepped forward, her hands still trembling but her voice steady. "Not until you're out of my house." The sound of sirens grew louder, and within moments flashing lights illuminated the street outside. Zeus didn't release his grip until the officers entered the house, their voices calm but commanding as they approached the scene. "Good boy," one of them said, patting Zeus's side as they restrained the intruder. "You've done it again." Eleanor exhaled deeply, her hands shaking as she leaned against the counter. Once the house was secure, one of the officers stayed behind to take Eleanor's statement. Zeus lay at her feet, his body finally relaxing now that the danger had passed. "You've got one amazing dog here," the officer said, smiling down at Zeus. "I know," Eleanor replied, her voice soft but full of gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without him." The officer nodded. "Dobermans like him aren't just pets, they're partners, and he's clearly very loyal to you." Eleanor looked down at Zeus, her heart swelling with pride. "He's more than loyal. He's family." That night, after the police had left and the house was quiet once more, Eleanor sat on the couch with Zeus curled up beside her. She stroked his fur gently, her mind racing with everything that had happened. "You saved me again," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "You always know what to do, don't you?" Zeus lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that brought tears to her eyes. Eleanor leaned down, pressing her forehead gently against his. "I'll never take you for granted," she said softly. "You're my hero." Zeus wagged his tail lightly, his body relaxing completely against her. For the first time in years, Eleanor didn't feel afraid. She didn't feel alone. Zeus had given her more than protection. He'd given her a sense of hope she hadn't realized she'd lost. The morning after the second break-in, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over the table where Eleanor sat with a steaming cup of tea. Zeus lay at her feet, his body relaxed but his eyes still scanning the room, ever watchful. Eleanor gazed down at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You've done more for me than I ever thought possible, Zeus," she murmured. The dog lifted his head, his tail wagging softly at the sound of her voice. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Eleanor stood, peering out the window to see Lauren stepping out, carrying a small bag. Zeus perked up, recognizing her scent from her visit days earlier. Eleanor opened the door just as Lauren approached, a tentative smile on her face. "Morning, Mom," Lauren said, glancing at Zeus. "How's our hero doing?" Eleanor chuckled, stepping aside to let her daughter in. "He's fine, better than fine, actually. Come in." Lauren placed the bag on the counter and pulled out a small package of dog treats. She crouched down, holding one out to Zeus. "You deserve this, big guy," she said, her voice warm. Zeus took the treat gently, his tail wagging in appreciation. Eleanor watched the interaction with a smile. "I think he likes you." Lauren stood, brushing her hands off. "Well, I like him too. I was thinking maybe I could come by more often, help out with Zeus and just spend time here." Eleanor's chest tightened, a wave of emotion washing over her. "I'd like that, Lauren. I'd like that very much." The day felt lighter, filled with small but meaningful moments. Eleanor and Lauren sat on the porch with Zeus at their feet, talking about everything and nothing. They reminisced about old family trips, shared updates about their lives, and even planned a small home improvement project to repair the damage from the break-ins. "I was so scared when I heard what happened," Lauren admitted, her voice quiet. "I couldn't stop thinking about, what if I'd lost you?" Eleanor placed a hand on her daughter's. "You didn't lose me. And thanks to Zeus, I didn't lose you either." Lauren smiled, her eyes glistening. "He really brought us back together, didn't he?" Eleanor nodded. "He's more than a protector, he's family now." A few weeks later, the house felt more alive than it had in years. Lauren had started visiting regularly, bringing small gifts for Zeus and helping Eleanor around the house. The mother and daughter began to repair the years of distance between them, finding solace in each other's company. Zeus, of course, remained at the center of it all. He seemed to thrive on the newfound energy in the house, his tail wagging more often and his eyes filled with a quiet joy. One afternoon, as Eleanor and Lauren sat in the living room, Lauren turned to her mother with a mischievous smile. "I've been thinking," she said. "Zeus is amazing, but maybe he could use some backup. What do you think about adopting another dog?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow, surprised but intrigued. "Another dog? Why not?" Lauren said with a shrug. "Zeus has done so much for us. Maybe we could give another dog a home, and it could be something we do together." Eleanor looked at Zeus, who was lounging by the window, his head resting on his paws. He seemed perfectly content, but the idea of adding another companion to their little family felt right. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Eleanor said, her voice warm. A few days later, the two women visited the local shelter together. The staff greeted them warmly, recognizing Zeus from the stories circulating in the neighborhood about his heroics. As they walked through the rows of kennels, Lauren spotted a small, mixed-breed puppy with bright eyes and a wagging tail. "This one," she said, pointing. Eleanor crouched down, studying the puppy. It barked softly, pressing its tiny paws against the kennel door. "Zeus," who had accompanied them, sniffed the puppy through the bars and gave a soft wag of approval. "I think he likes her," Eleanor said with a laugh. "Then it's settled," Lauren replied. Bringing the new puppy home felt like the beginning of a fresh chapter. The small dog, whom they named Daisy, was energetic and playful, bringing a spark of youthful joy to the house. Zeus quickly took on the role of mentor, guiding Daisy with gentle nudges and patient tolerance of her antics. For Eleanor, life had transformed in ways she hadn't imagined. She had gone from lonely nights in a quiet house to a bustling, vibrant home filled with laughter, love, and the companionship of two incredible dogs. As she sat on the porch one evening, watching Zeus and Daisy play in the yard, Lauren joined her with 2 cups of tea. "You seem happy," Lauren said, handing her mother a cup. Eleanor smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I am. For the first time in a long time, I really am." Lauren placed a hand on her mother's. "Me too, Mum." Zeus trotted over, sitting at Eleanor's feet as Daisy chased a leaf across the grass. Eleanor reached down to scratch behind his ears, her heart full. "You've brought us more than safety," she said softly to Zeus. "You've brought us back together." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in a warm golden glow. Eleanor, Lauren, Zeus, and Daisy sat together, a family united by love, loyalty, and second chances. For Eleanor, it was clear, this wasn't just a new beginning. It was the life she'd been waiting for all along,